Thank you for joining us this morning. I'd like to start by letting you know who I am. I'm Evelyne Tadros, the CEO of the Mental Health Coordinating Council. I'm 5 weeks in and I look forward to meeting those of you who I haven't met and working with you in the long term. I'd like to start by acknowledging the traditional owners and custodians of the land on which we meet today. Here at Lilyfield, we are on the land of the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation, and I pay my respects to their elders, both past, present and emerging. And likewise, I pay my respects to people with lived and living experience of mental health conditions and trauma, their families and carers, including those here today, and recognise their many contributions to reform processes across the mental health services sector. For those of you who are new to the work of the Mental Health Coordinating Council, or MHCC, we are the peak body for mental health community managed organisations in New South Wales. MHCC provides policy leadership, promotes legislative reform and systemic changes, and develops resources and training to assist community organisations to deliver quality and effective services underpinned by best practice principles. MHCC also has a learning development arm, which is a registered training organisation, providing accredited training and professional development to the sector. MHCC is also co-founding member of the Community Mental Health Australia, the Alliance of State and Territory Mental Health Peak Bodies, which together represent more than 800 community managed organisations delivering mental health and related psychosocial services nationally. I'm pleased to welcome you all to the 9th event in the Advocates and Allies webinar series. These events aim to provide mental health and psychosocial support workers with information about matters relevant to the work that they do, such as the broader mental health and trauma services environment, reform processes and cross-sectorial issues, as well as best practice approaches. This morning, we have 3 great presenters here with us, Karyn Bartholomew, Dr. Michelle Blanchard and Tim Heffernan. Our first presenter today is Karyn Bartholomew. Karyn is the Manager of Enquiries and Conciliation with Anti-Discrimination New South Wales at the Department of Communities and Justice, and we'll talk about Anti-Discrimination New South Wales' commitment to eliminating discrimination and providing equality and equal treatment for everyone in New South Wales, including by resolving inquiries and complaints, raising awareness about discrimination and its impacts. Karyn joined as a conciliation officer in 2017. Prior to that, Karyn was a solicitor in a community legal centre. Karyn has seen the difference that having a skilled advocate can make to the outcomes for people living with a disability. Thanks for joining us, Karyn, and over to you.
Hi, thanks Evelyne, and thanks everybody. So I'm here to talk about Anti-Discrimination New South Wales. So we administer the Anti-Discrimination Act, which is only applies to New South Wales. So I've just seen some names of people sort of saying hello from other areas which might not be in New South Wales. So I'll just put that disclaimer on. Every state has its own legislation. There's also the Human Rights Commission, which administers Commonwealth legislation, which is slightly different to ours. I'll also open by acknowledging the fact that our legislation is very old. It was 1977, and so it hasn't kept up with, the societal expectations. But I'm happy to report that the Attorney General has recently, within the last week or so, referred the Act to the Law Reform Commission for hopefully a major review. So the terms of reference are on the Law Reform Commission website. If anyone wants to have a look and make a submission, I'd really encourage you to, because we are well aware that the legislation needs a real update. So I'll share my screen, and I'll also like to just own that this is the first time I've presented using Zoom, so I might be a little bit clunky. So in terms of the Anti-Discrimination Act, it fundamentally sets up a complaints mechanism for people to lodge complaints, and that the Act deals with the complaint handling functions of it. But in addition to that, we also have a communications and engagement team, which goes out into the community and engages more broadly to raise awareness about the protections under the Anti-Discrimination Act, and works with other organisations and has a pretty active social media presence. There's also our governance and advice team makes submissions and things like that to government inquiries, and so in addition to the complaint handling processes, which are fairly constrained by what's in the legislation, we have a broader presence than that, and so in that respect, that's how we promote and protect against discrimination in the broader community. So I'll go through, if you can all see my screens, we'll go through fairly quickly. I've only got 10 minutes to talk, so I don't know how quickly I might get through it all, or we might not, but we have questions at the end. But basically, we have, as I said, a complaint handling function. So we have an inquiries team. We encourage people to call our inquiries line to get information about what is discrimination. It's under the legislation. It's a fairly defined definition of discrimination. All of this information is on our website, so I'll go through it fairly quickly, and the slides can be made available if you want it. So the Anti-Discrimination Act, for people who've been sort of around for a long time, we used to be known as the Anti-Discrimination Board. We are now Anti-Discrimination New South Wales. Under the Act, there's the President and the Board. ADNSW is sort of the administrative arm. So if that's the terminology that we use now, is ADNSW. And so we answer inquiries, resolve complaints, raise awareness, fairly self-explanatory. This is important. Discrimination is treating someone less favourably because they have a characteristic or are assumed to have a certain characteristic that's protected by under New South Wales law. The term of less favourable treatment that's in the legislation. It's different to being treated unfairly, and we get a lot of people who say, look, all of this stuff's happened to me, it's not fair. But what we need to be able to satisfy for a complaint to be upheld is that they've been treated less favourably in the same or similar circumstances because they have a characteristic that's protected under the legislation. So we try to, and this is the legal definition, to compare apples with apples as much as we can. So this whole idea of in the same or similar circumstances is long-winded, but it's actually technically quite important. That's how we filter the information. If a complaint's lodged, that's what we're looking for, and so that's the information that we ask people to provide if they can. So the grounds of discrimination, it's limited to those grounds which doesn't cover everything. We're hoping that there will be more. One of the updates will be around sex. So it's not just sex or homosexuality. It could be sexuality or sexual orientation. Those sorts of things. More nuanced definitions of the grounds. Disability can include a presumed disability, disease or disability. So I'm going now. Disability discrimination is our biggest area. The biggest area of complaints we receive deal with complaints of disability discrimination, and a lot of those are to do with mental health as well. So the stats are there. A quarter of inquiries that we got, they're not completely up to date, but we don't see really any change in these stats from year to year. Mostly they come in goods and services, so people being denied a service or refused a service or provided a service on less favourable terms because they've got a disability. So you can see nearly half of the complaints that we received in the last reporting period were to do with disability discrimination. Direct and indirect discrimination, they're legal definitions. So mostly direct discrimination is where someone, it's apparent that they've been treated differently or less favourably because they've got a disability. Indirect discrimination can be a little harder. That's where there's a requirement for someone to comply with some sort of requirement that's not reasonable, that in the circumstances, and they can't comply because of their disability. This is a good example, and this can help people understand. We get a lot of complaints from people to say, this awful thing has happened to me, or this is, all of these awful things have happened to me, and I've got a disability, and, I can't do these sorts of things because of my disability. This is an illustration of somebody who has been, denied or refused a service, I guess, penalised, who lodged a complaint believing it's because of his hearing impairment. But where we see an organisation that has a blanket policy that's applied the same to everybody, and this is a good example of where there was a penalty, everybody would have gotten the same penalty regardless of whether they had a disability or not. And so that's the sort of complaint that we would probably decline up front or before it gets to conciliation. So discrimination, the Act only applies in these 5 areas. So it's very, very restricted in its application. So most of our complaints are in employment and goods and services. Not so many in accommodation. We've got a lot of disability discrimination in education. So children with behavioural issues, for example, is a fairly common complaint, and then they're really quite tricky to resolve. These are where discrimination is not unlawful. So we get also a lot of people complaining their child is in a private school. We can't deal with it. So Enquiries, we have a call centre. You can ring at any time between 9 and 4, and somebody should be available to take your call, or you can leave a message if everybody is on the line at the time. And our inquiry officers, they can give you information about what the whether or not a matter could fall under the scope of the Act. If you're talking about a particular instance, they'll give you really good information about what is covered, what's in, what's out, where you can go to get more assistance. It's really important to stress that we're an impartial body. We can't give advice, so we have a referral service to organisations that can give advice. We have a memorandum of understanding with legal aid, so the 3rd Wednesday of the month they have appointments. We facilitate the appointments, but then we're hands off. That's all we do, so people can get independent advice from a legal aid solicitor on a one-off basis. There are referrals to community legal centres. There are some pro bono law firms that we can make a warm referral to if something's really kind of urgent and big. So that's what our Enquiries service does. When you lodge a complaint, the complaint needs to be in writing. It can be in any language. We will organise for the complaint to be interpreted with Multicultural New South Wales. So the inquiry officers can help, and under the legislation, the President, so under delegated authority, the inquiry officers can assist a party to write their complaint. So that's limited only to transcribing a complaint, and we really only do that as a last resort. We did recently transcribe a complaint from somebody with a disability using the voice to text function on Teams, and that worked very well. So we didn't actually physically write the complaint. So they dictated it, and so there was no input from us. But we're really reluctant to do that because we are impartial. We can't give any input or feedback to a person to say, oh, look, you haven't provided enough information. We're simply transcribing the complaint, and it's so frustrating then if a person, and we do it so rarely that it hardly ever happens, but you can imagine if somebody, we've transcribed a complaint, they lodge the complaint, it comes through our assessment process, and we say, oh, you haven't actually provided the information we need, and send it back to them. And so that's one of the reasons why we really hope that more advocates can get involved, and that people can get assistance to write the complaint by a body that's not us, because we are so constrained by what we can do. So they need to, you need to be able to demonstrate the information that you provide, or the complainant provides needs to be able to demonstrate that they have got a protected ground in a protected area, and that the treatment, that there was some sort of detriment, that there was less favourable treatment because of, there needs to be that connection between, you know, in this case, a disability and the treatment that they're complaining about. There's also a 12-month limitation period that's discretionary, but that can be extended or set aside if there's reason to do that. And so our investigation is, it's not a forensic investigation. We really just help the parties to exchange information and understand each other's point of view, and to assist the parties to resolve the complaint if that's possible at all. So it's by negotiation. It's always going to be on a without admissions basis. So we don't have any powers to test any evidence, or to make findings of fact or law, or to impose orders or, you know, penalties or anything like that. That's the tribunal. If the matter doesn't resolve, it goes off to the tribunal, and that's the really, you know, the full-on legal process. We're alternative dispute resolution, so it's about just trying to work with the parties to come to some kind of amicable, you know, negotiated outcome. So the investigation process, you know, it's backwards and forwards of an exchanging information. It can take some time. We usually give a respondent, you know, 28 days to respond, and then, you know, the complainant gets an opportunity to put in their comments. And so by the time we've finalised the investigation, it can take maybe, you know, 3 or 4 months, depending on the circumstances. And then we look at conciliation. After the investigation phase, we may say, look, there's nothing here to demonstrate that there could be a possible connection between the disability. It could be, you know, like the example that I just talked about before. You know, this thing has happened, but there's nothing to demonstrate it was because of a characteristic that a person had. So it can be declined at that point, or we can say, okay, let's see if we can help the parties to resolve it. Generally, that happens in a conciliation conference, but it can happen by shuttle negotiation. If that's more appropriate to the circumstances. We're pretty flexible in how we do this. General examples of outcomes of conciliation, you know, often it's compensation. Often, often respondents will say, no, that's nothing. Yeah, it didn't happen, or it wasn't because of, you know, there was another explanation for whatever happened, and they'll wait to go to the tribunal to test the evidence. But often respondents will say, look, okay, let's agree to disagree, and here's some compensation. We're sorry that you feel this way, and make it go away. Don't often see reinstatements, because, you know, by the time we get to that point, it's moved on. If a matter is really urgent, though, if it looks like something's happened, for example, in the workplace, and somebody's employment is at risk now, we will pull that out of the queue and we'll deal with it. We'll try and get it on for a quick conciliation of some form or other, even without you know, going through the full investigation process. So we can be very reactive when a matter is urgent. Especially if someone's or accommodation is at risk because of whatever's going on, regardless of whether or not it's going to turn out that it is discrimination, we will try to fast track it, and you know, if a person's at risk for any reason of any type, we'll grab it and deal with it. There's also just like you to know, in the Anti-Discrimination Act, I think it's section 105, parties can apply to the Civil and Administrative Tribunal for an order, basically to preserve the status quo, so to prevent the respondent doing anything that's going to you know, change the situation between the parties while the complaint is on foot. So that's something that you can do as soon as the complaint's lodged, is then go to the tribunal and say, look, we've lodged a complaint, we want this order to preserve the position, and then that kind of buys some time to to then catch up and draw breath and see what can be done to help resolve the situation. So conciliation works best when the complainant's clear, they're prepared to compromise, and they focus on resolution rather than the facts or the law. So because we're not going to have an argument about, well, he said, she said, this happened, that didn't happen. It just needs to be, realistic. How do we resolve it? How do we move on? If a complaint's not resolved, it can be referred to the tribunal, the Civil and Administrative Tribunal, and generally once it gets there, there's another opportunity to have a mediation, so before it goes to a hearing, but exchange of statements and all the rest of it, it ramps up. So yeah, that's it in a nutshell, a very quick nutshell. Please contact us if you have any questions at all. Here to, the inquiries line is always here to talk to people, give you information that you might need that would help you help your clients. And I think that's probably me out of time.
Thank you so much, Karyn. A wealth of information, and hopefully support everyone online to best support people with lived experience. And we will have a panel discussion with some Q&A later on. So please use the Q&A function at the bottom of the Zoom to post your questions. And I can already see some questions coming through for you, Karyn, which I'll bring to your attention when we have the panel. Our next presenter is Dr. Michelle Blanchard. Michelle is the Executive Director of Strategic Projects at the National Mental Health Commission and has been leading the development of the National Stigma and Discrimination Reduction Strategy, which is currently with government for consideration. Before joining the Commission, Michelle was Deputy CEO at SANE Australia and is the founding director of SANE's Anne Devison Research Centre, which partners with people affected by complex mental health issues, trauma and distress to catalyse social change. Michelle is an honorary senior fellow at the Melbourne School of Psychological Science at the University of Melbourne. Previously, Michelle held senior roles as with the Buttery Foundation for Eating Disorders and the Young and Well Cooperative Research Centre. Michelle will talk about a long-term vision for Australia where everyone has equal dignity, value and respect, and opportunities to choose a life of personal meaning and purpose, free from mental health related stigma and discrimination. Welcome, Michelle.
Thank you so much. And it's really wonderful to be here today. I'm joining you from Boonwurrung country down in Victoria, and I'm really excited to be able to share a little bit with you about some of the work that we've been doing at the National Mental Health Commission to develop a national stigma and discrimination reduction strategy. You're going to hear a little bit later on from Tim Heffernan, who has been the fabulous co-chair of our steering committee for this project, working alongside Kevin Bell, who's a human rights expert. And what I wanted to do today is not so much take you through the draft strategy itself, but to talk a little bit about some of the things we have needed to grapple with as we've been developing this strategy. Karyn did a really fantastic job earlier of taking you through some of the disability discrimination context in New South Wales. And one of the things that we really had to consider and grapple with as we were developing this national strategy is how people conceive of and understand their experiences. Do they see them as disabilities? Do they see them as a form of neurodiversity, a way of experiencing this world differently? And so I wanted to take you through a little bit of our thought process of how we examined that as we were developing the strategy. So the Commission was tasked with this piece of work back at the end of 2020, and it was a recommendation out of the Productivity Commission inquiry into mental health that there be a national strategy developed to tackle stigma and discrimination towards those of us who experience mental ill health or mental health issues, and those who care for and support us. And so our goal has been to develop a strategy that takes a really holistic approach to addressing stigma and discrimination. We know that work to reduce stigma in Australia is not new. In fact, 40 years ago this year, Brian Burdekin launched his report into the human rights of people who experience mental health issues in Australia. And sadly, very little has changed, despite some really significant efforts, particularly around changing public stigma, so changing people's attitudes towards those of us who have personal lived experience and those who might support us. So we wanted to take a holistic approach that also tackled structural stigma and discrimination. So when we talk about structural stigma, we talk about those laws, policies, practices, and cultures within our systems and institutions that result in the unfair treatment of people with personal lived experience or people who have a caring experience. And we also wanted to ensure that we were tackling self-stigma, so changing how we feel about ourselves when we might experience a mental health issue. Throughout this project, we've taken a really collaborative approach to working really alongside and with people with lived experience and people with other forms of expertise. And Tim will talk a little bit about that later on. But we also engaged with researchers to guide this work. And one particular group we worked with was the behavioural economics team in the Department of Prime Minister and the Cabinet, who undertook a survey for us of just under 8,000 members of the Australian community, where they asked people about their attitudes towards those of us who might be experiencing a mental health issue, and also asked those in the community who had had an experience of a mental health issue what their experiences had been. And what this showed us was that while there was certainly good intentions from people towards wanting to be supportive towards people who might be experiencing a mental health issue, there was also a really significant acknowledgement that more needed to be done to eliminate discrimination. So actually 83% of the almost 8,000 people surveyed said more needed to be done to eliminate discrimination towards people affected by mental health problems. The research that the beta team did for us also threw up a whole bunch of conundrums. And so this is where we really needed to dig deep with folks with lived experience, with people from the workforce, from people from academic and other backgrounds. We found some things that kind of reflected what we thought the situation might be, in particular that there are some experiences that are more frequently stigmatized. And that includes stigma towards people who might be diagnosed with schizophrenia or might have been diagnosed with borderline personality disorder or experienced significant trauma. We also found that while it's now far less common for people to perceive having a mental health issue as a personal failing, people don't see it as a weakness or something that the person has caused themselves. It's far more likely for people to believe that the person is at the whim of something that they can't control. And so while that might be helpful in terms of shifting that understanding away from personal blame or responsibility, unfortunately, what it does is reinforce some of the negative and inaccurate stereotypes that relate to violence, unpredictability, and dangerousness. And what we found was that those kinds of views were more commonly held by people who had a purely biomedical understanding of the origins of mental health issues. So where people understood mental health issues as a medical issue like any other, a disease of the brain, those kinds of associations tended to lead towards a stronger sense that someone might be unpredictable or behave in a way that's out of their control. Whereas when people understood people's experiences in terms of their complex mixture of their biology, their psychology, their social environment, so those social determinants of health, people had a far more nuanced and helpful understanding of those experiences. And we also found that there were a couple of groups in the community who did express stigmatizing views more frequently. That included younger people, which really surprised us, people from culturally and linguistically diverse backgrounds, and men. And the caveat that I always put on that data is that the way that we understand stigma is still a very white Western way of understanding stigma and discrimination. And so what that actually tells us is that we need to do more work with culturally and linguistically diverse communities to really understand how people make sense of their experiences and then how stigma and discrimination might play out. So these conundrums actually led us to take a bit of a look at some work around adaptive leadership. And so some of you who've done kind of leadership development training may have come across this concept before. It's used a lot in terms of thinking about leading teams and creating change in organizations. But what it does is it sets up the difference between what is a technical problem and what might be an adaptive challenge. And a technical problem is something that's really easy to identify and has a really easy, straightforward solution. So it might be that there is a waiting list for a particular type of service, where you might be able to fix that by employing more people in the workforce to be able to meet the demand for the service. Pretty easy, pretty straightforward. Can generally be solved by an authority or an expert. It's a pretty clear, quick change. It might involve training people up. It might involve kind of growing the budget of a service, but it's relatively straightforward to do. Stigma and discrimination are really, though, far more entrenched, nuanced, complex challenges to solve. And that means they're what we call an adaptive challenge. And so an adaptive challenge is something where it actually can be quite difficult to define the concept or the complexity of the situation. It needs everyone to be involved in changing the environment, in changing the culture, and changing the way in which people are treated. It might involve lots of different changes happening at the same time. So not just a single solution, but actually needing change in our laws, needing change in our cultures and change in our practices within organisations. And often it arises in situations where there can be a bit of resistance to actually taking a particular solution or a particular way of being able to resolve the challenge. And so it led us to think really, really deeply about some of this work and to some thinking around what's called a polarity. So a polarity is this idea that in a system, you actually have at least two interdependent parts that form that system. And that often creates some tensions and forces within the system. And that can happen on an individual level, within an organisation, or within a society at large. And so we spent a bit of time through a series of workshops actually mapping out some of the complexity and some of the polarities that exist in reducing stigma and discrimination. And we worked with a fabulous group from Cultivating Leadership who helped us to do that. And what it kind of led us to is this sense that there's no one right solution. And so what we often need to do is use both kinds of solutions or both options rather than choosing one approach over another. But that it's really important that it all aims towards a much higher purpose. And in our case, that's around an Australian society where everyone is treated with dignity and respect. Their value is recognised and acknowledged, and people can live a life of meaning and purpose free from stigma and discrimination. This approach really helps us to be able to navigate some of the complexity without oversimplifying things, and without alienating people who might have very different or divergent views that we actually need to be part of the solution. So some of the polarities that came up for us in addressing stigma and discrimination is this idea of the medical model and social determinants. And, what we found was, as we spoke about a purely social way of understanding mental health issues, some people didn't feel that represented their experiences, whereas others felt that the medical model really didn't help, and in fact created some difficulty and some challenges and potential harms for them. We had lots of long conversations around, do we address self-stigma by actually focusing on the individual or by tackling public and structural stigma? Because we know that the way that we feel about ourselves is influenced by the environment around us. Do we focus purely on legislating change and forcing people to behave in different ways? Or do we try and appeal to people's hearts and minds? Do we focus on individual autonomy or on community and collective safety? Do we focus on the whole population and this sense of a common humanity? Or do we target particular groups in the community that might experience stigma and discrimination more acutely, or might express these kinds of attitudes more frequently than others do? So what this has meant for us as we've been developing the strategy is that we've taken a really integrated approach to tackling self-stigma, public stigma, and structural stigma and discrimination. We've focused on using lots of levers for change, so changing legislation, promoting stronger accountability mechanisms, simplifying complaints processes, developing standards, peer-led education and investments in strengthening the lived experience peer workforce, and the importance of actually connecting with other people who might have experiences of mental ill health. It's led us to really focus on making recommendations across a range of settings where stigma and discrimination might occur. So not just the mental health system, but also looking at workplaces and looking at the legal system, looking at child protection, a range of other environments. And it means that we've taken a kind of both and approach to the language that we've used in the strategy and recommended actions so that everyone can hopefully see themselves and their experiences in the work that we've presented. So as you heard at the start, the strategy is with government for consideration at the moment. All of the materials that were generated in the development of the draft strategy, including the draft strategy itself, are all available on the Mental Health Commission's website, and really encourage you to access those materials and also to read some of the insights from people with lived experience who participated in workshops or participated in different conversations to help us design the strategy. So I will pause there, but thanks again, Evelyne, and to the team for the opportunity to share a bit with you about this work.
Thank you so much, Michelle. I think you've given us all a lot of food for thought in terms of addressing stigma and discrimination and the many dichotomies that exist. And I can see a few questions coming through the chat, but I have a lot coming through in the Q&A section. So we look forward to you joining the panel a bit later. Our next speaker is Tim Heffernan. Tim is the co-chair of the National Stigma and Discrimination Reduction Strategy Steering Committee, as Michelle alluded to earlier, and is the current Deputy Commissioner at the Mental Health Commission in New South Wales. He's a past chair of Being, New South Wales Consumer Advisory Group, and the New South Wales Public Mental Health Consumer Workers Committee. and was Deputy Co-Chair of the National Peer Workforce Development Guidelines Steering Committee. He's an executive member of the Illawarra Shoalhaven Suicide Prevention Collaborative. He enjoyed a 20-year teaching career before moving to disability support work and peer work. Tim will talk about how the lived experience perspective and human rights were integrated into the development of the strategy and how they were reflected in the strategy moving forward. Over to you, Tim. Thank you.
Okay, thanks, Evelyne, and thanks to Karyn and Michelle for their presentations. There's a lot to work through, and certainly, you know, I want to begin by thanking Michelle and the team. If you go to the website and look at the record of the consultations, the draft strategy, you'll see just such a rich process that's been undertaken. I'd like to acknowledge that I'm on beautiful Dharawal country in Wollongong, and pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging, and acknowledge any people who from Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander descent in the room today. I'm going without slides, so you don't have to stress too much about whether a copy will be available, but I'm sure copies of Karyn's and Michelle's are going to be available. So you just got me at the moment. This is to me a hugely important piece of work that, done properly, will improve the lives of many people. I think when I first came into, was invited into the space, privileged, I must admit, to be invited to be a co-chair of the strategy. I was asked to reflect on a little bit about what it might mean to me, and I came up with a little piece which is on the website somewhere about stigma. You know, to me, stigma is a persistent dry wind that strips us of our humanity. I chose to be involved because the National Stigma Discrimination Strategy has the potential to ensure the human rights of people who touch this earth differently are actively supported, so that we can live our lives in the ways that we choose. Now, there's a little bit behind that, you know, the persistent dry wind. We've got the El Nino event happening again. This was penned probably back in about 2020, almost 21. With the fires on the south coast here and throughout, and we have human intervention driving these terrible events on our planet at the moment, and we just have to look at the news. And in a similar way, human intervention has stripped people with mental health issues of their humanity, of their potential, and ultimately have left them as being forgotten, ignored, and not able to live the lives that they can live. And so it's an artificial thing. And this strategy can potentially change that artificial imposed way of thinking about people who, as I say, touch the earth differently. And that touch is hardly ever a negative touch. And we have to realize that the capacity and the creativity that we have in people. So anyway, that's that. So, but what's a lived experience perspective? You know, certainly we've moved away from illness and that biomedical approach of looking at who we are and what we're experiencing. You'll notice the strategy uses the word issues. Language is fluid, it's evolving, and we probably haven't landed at a good way to talk about all this quite yet. But we talk about in the strategy, personal lived experience, the experience of people like myself and Michelle, who have that personal lived experience of mental health issues. We talk about things like complex mental health issues, and I'm not a big, I don't like that term, but that's where we are at the moment. People who are experiencing mental health issues that impact significantly on the way they can interact with a world that's not constructed to be friendly towards them. We look at social emotional well-being. How much do we, as people with lived experience in our systems and services, how much do we have to learn from people from Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander backgrounds, and how much can we support all of the dialogue that's going on at the moment as we move to a referendum, and how do we do that in ways that are safe for people with Aboriginality and people with mental health issues. We talk of people with personal lived experience, but also people with lived experience as family carers and support people. So language has to be precise here. We shouldn't be using blanket terms always of lived experience and expecting people to understand that. Is that a combined lived experience? Is it that personal lived experience? Is it the family carer lived experience? And then I think we have to look at the lived experience workforce too. Everybody who identifies as having a lived experience of mental health issues has their own perspective. When we move to workforce, whether it's peer workers working on the ground in support roles, peer support roles, whether it's researchers, educators, managers, CEOs, those people who are working in designated lived experience roles in the workforce bring their own personal lived experience, but also the collective lived experience of our movement, a movement that started as a human rights movement in the 60s, and like any other human rights movement has moved forward and struggled to change things for the people that who we are to make things better. So that's a little bit about that perspective, and I think it's really important that we have multiple perspectives, we have multiple experiences, and the strategy works in a way, as Michelle explained, with that polarities to look at that. And I think the strategy also was needed to bring in the voices of services, the voices of people who provide services into this and into this discussion as well. So we brought into this space, what do we bring in? What do we bring in? We bring in our common humanity. We're all born. We all are created in the same act sort of thing, and we emerge into a world where sometimes inequality, difference are marked out, and people are marked as being different. I think with the consumer movement and the family and carer movement, especially the consumer movement, which is my perspective today, is that we were really advocating for this to happen. There was involvement of consumers directly to the Commission prior to this strategy even beginning. There was a great deal that went to the Productivity Commission and in the formation of the mental health plans from 1992 onwards. So this had to happen, and it needs to be led by lived experience. So we have important things like, obviously at the end of the Second World War, the atrocities that occurred to people, including people with lived experience, but certainly people from Jewish backgrounds. But we have the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. We have the Convention of the Rights of People with a Disability, which Australia signed up to in 2008. We had the really significant Burdekin report in Australia that followed on from the Richmond report in New South Wales, but the Burdekin report in 1993, a national inquiry into the human rights of people with mental illness. We know that something was going. We knew that something was going wrong. We had the emergence around 1993, and before that, of significant voices, lived experience voices. For instance, people like Janet Ma from the consumer perspective to say, and acknowledging Michelle's background from SANE Australia, and Devison from the carer point of view, voices who were saying, we have got the right to talk about our experience, we have the right to be heard, valued, and that nothing should be happening without us. So that mantra that you've heard before. But in saying all that, no process can reach and include everyone. No consultation can get to every single person. So I certainly acknowledge the people, the voices that are not heard or have not been able to be heard in the development of these strategies. and also the voices of people who chose not to be heard, because this wasn't a safe place for them. You know, often people's experiences of mental health treatment have meant that working in spaces that are not exclusively consumer spaces might not be too safe for people because of those experiences that they've had. So I think we have to acknowledge that always, and you know, and the way that this strategy has come from the 5th National Plan through the Productivity Commission, through the Mental Health Commission, we have the inclusion of the lived experience voice, and I think that should be amplified more in terms of true co-design and involvement in the way that we roll out this, we implement this. So, so in terms of that, it's very important that people with lived experience influenced this strategy. But as I said earlier, those people whose attitudes and behaviours, both negative and positive, towards people with mental illness had to be included in this strategy. And those people who implement programs to reduce stigma in Australia needed to be included as well. The leadership, to talk more directly about the lived experience involvement, I think we have leadership with lived experience. Michelle won't mind me saying that her own lived experience of mental health issues is a significant driver in her passion and her expertise in tackling these complex problems and leading this work. I want to acknowledge Professor Kevin Bell, who some of you will know, but he's a current member of the Uruk Justice Commission in Victoria. He was a former director of the Caston Centre for Human Rights and a justice of the Supreme Court of Victoria. But Kevin also brings that lived experience as a family member, as a carer, a support person for someone with lived experience. And so, and in terms of bringing in that and really sharpening our human rights focus, we were so lucky to have Kevin there. I think you might be aware the project had a steering committee where probably 8 out of the 11 had lived experience in that broad term. 6 or more, who knows, have that personal lived experience. At least 6 of the people on that declaring that personal lived experience of mental health issues. We also had technical advisory groups looking at structural stigma, public stigma, self-stigma, and measurement. And I'll come back to that language thing again, but which was co-chaired by a person with lived experience and someone with experience of other expertise. So back in that language, the language of self-stigma and stigma is also something that is still out there, and we haven't landed on the best way to articulate this. So in terms of our human movement, I think you would have a lot of people who would be framing this as purely as discrimination and the impact of discrimination and things like victim blaming on people rather than that self-stigma. So that internalizing of the things you hear all the time is what we call self-stigma. But for a lot of us, it is simply a result of significant discrimination. So we set out with quite a solid structure in terms of lived experience informing and being involved in consultations. We went through, as a number of you would be aware, a national survey starting in August of 2021. I think we had 8,000 responses to that, a representative sample, which would certainly include that lived experience voice. We had consultations with Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people early 2021, consultations with culturally and linguistic diverse community leaders in 2022, March. And we had then we had working groups or working parties around specific areas of the strategy, which involved a number of consumers. Each one of those working groups had a balance, I think, of people with lived experience in them. So we looked at the mental health system, the health systems, the social world, disability, income supporting and housing, employment, financial services, insurance and law, and education and training. And a draft survey which went out, and through surveys we had about almost 400 responses to that, including responses from people with lived experience, people with lived experience of personal lived experience of family caring and support, and from services and organisations. So running out a little bit of time. So I think this has had substantial leadership and substantial input from people with lived experience. We wouldn't call the whole process a co-design process, but I do think we're moving towards that in the implementation. We have, I think, early on in the consultation, we landed on some principles which have carried the way through the draft strategy. So in the implementation of this, we'll always be looking at it as a primary thing is about this strategy is to protect and uphold the dignity and human rights of people who have personal lived experience, and also those who support them. It really pointed out to us that the strategy needed to be guided or governed by lived experience leadership. That also there a particular thing that I'm passionate about is that people saw the expanding lived experience workforce as a key action which could increase and influence the visibility of people with lived experience. The designated lived experience workforce has been an emerging stigma strategy that's come from the grassroots for some time, since 1993, when we started at Rozelle Hospital in New South Wales, that workforce where people are saying, I am proud of who I am, of what I've experienced and where I've come from and where I'm going, and I'm going to wear it. I'm going to work in this designated lived experience position. And the strategy has picked up on that. I think it has. There is a central role for lived experience leadership, and lived experience workforce. With all that, we have so much that we can move forward with. But I think it also looked at that intersectionality. It really looked at the need to understand and respond to culture, spirituality, identity, intersectionality, as I said, and community as being central drivers of that implementation. It has to be responsive to our diverse experiences, and each one of us has multiple diverse experiences, that intersectionality and diverse needs. I think, as we picked up, it really needs to go back to where it began, I think, with this concern about how much stigma and discrimination is felt every single day by people who navigate a very complex relationship with this world. And, I think that's really important. What's being implemented, I say thanks Giselle on there in the chat. what I think what Michelle was trying to say is that the strategy is looking at a range of structural drivers, levers, plus specific leaders. So there's online we have the draft strategy, and hopefully soon we will have the release of the full strategy. So, you know, it has been a really important thing for me to be involved in. It has at times been a heavy thing to be involved in. It has been, though, that heaviness once lifted, it is potentially liberating. As I said before, when people want to get out there and work in systems that have failed them, to change those systems and cultures and get rid of the stigma and start really working to look after their own, I think you have one of the most powerful levers of leadership. So to go, it's lived experience leadership, it's workforce, and it's looking at that diversity in our society. So I'll leave it there. Thank you. Thanks, Evelyne.
Thank you so much, Tim. There are lots of questions coming in, and I don't know that we're going to get to them all, but can I ask my fellow colleagues to put their cameras on? Thank you, Michelle. Karyn, if you can put your camera on, and then we're just going to get some of these questions from our colleagues on the webinar answered. So if we might go to Karyn for the first question. Karyn, can volunteers who are engaged in the workplace also be eligible to lodge complaints if they feel they've been discriminated against?
Voluntary employment isn't covered. Unfortunately, that's a gap in the legislation.
Okay, that was a quick one.
It's a quick question, yeah, quick
that's
answer.
Why I'm trying to get some quick ones for you, because some of the longer ones might take a bit more time just for me to read them. So that one's for you, Rachel. I've got another one. For you, Karyn, can New South Wales Police, within the execution of their duty, discriminate against a person who's experiencing mental health condition?
That's a kind of a complex one. So that goes to the definition of what's a service. And sometimes, you know, police can be seen to be providing a service, but the broad definition of a service is whether or not that service is beneficial or helpful to a person, and whether a person has the capacity to opt in or opt out of that, or, you know, choose to, you know, partake in that service. When a service provider is acting in the execution of a statutory duty, for example, that's not a service. So, you know, there are instances where police would be providing a service. So an example would be when an arrest is made and someone's taken into custody, for example, that's not a service to the person, because that's a service to the community to protect the safety of the community, ostensibly. However, while in custody, the police are providing a service to make sure that that person is protected and kept safe and fed and, you know, looked after while in custody. So, you know, there's two, yeah, it stops and starts and stops and starts. So it's complex, and each one would depend on its own facts.
Thank you. And I'll give you one more, Karyn, and then you can catch your breath. Does anti-discrimination have any role, as in Anti-Discrimination New South Wales, have any role in more indirect systemic discrimination and barriers that people may experience? I guess in addressing the systemic discrimination.
Yeah, we don't have any powers to initiate our own investigations or make comment. We're really, you know, we're a bit of a blunt instrument in that respect in terms of our complaint handling. We can make submissions to government inquiries and things like that, but, you know, it's really about, we rely on people to lodge a complaint, and then, you know, through that complaint process, systemic change can happen, but it relies on the complainant, and we acknowledge that that's difficult. and a burden, but that's why we try to encourage advocates to get involved in the process. So
thank you, Karyn. I apologise if my reception keeps cutting in and out, but we'll keep going. Michelle, there was a couple of comments in chat. I'm switching between chat and the Q&A, and there was a couple of comments in the chat about dual diagnosis of drug and alcohol and mental health not necessarily being listed as a stigmatized group. Have you got any comments on that one?
Yeah, so we grappled with this one. This was, again, one of those issues where some folks considered their experience of alcohol and other drug issues to be part and parcel of their mental health issue or their personal lived experience. For other people, they saw them as quite a separate and quite a different experience. In the strategy itself, we do have a section that talks about the specific stigma that people who experience alcohol and other drug issues might face. The nature of the stigma is slightly different, and the nature of the discrimination is slightly different. Some drugs, for example, are still criminalised. And so there is a stigma associated with a behaviour that's considered to be criminal in nature, and a real need for us to shift the conversation to one that is much more about a health and wellbeing issue, and something that people can access help and support for, rather than something that's dealt with through a criminalised or criminal system. So there's differences, but there are also some commonalities, and we hope that some of the recommendations we've made in the strategy, particularly around human rights and the need for stronger accountability, actually will benefit people across the board. So not just folks who might experience mental health issues.
Thanks, Michelle. And another one for you is, have consumers and carers told you about the long-term effects of discrimination?
Yes, absolutely. And, it's been really powerful to hear from people with lived experience about the impact that being stigmatized or discriminated against early on in people's experience has had. One of the really significant impacts that being stigmatized or discriminated can have is that it changes how you feel about yourself. And it changes the kinds of opportunities that you might put yourself forward to, the kinds of relationships that you're open to being in, whether they're romantic relationships or friendships, the kinds of jobs you might put yourself forward for, and the types of supports that you might seek. So people will often hold back from those kinds of opportunities because they fear that they'll be stigmatized or discriminated. Something that people say quite frequently is that actually the experience of being stigmatized or being discriminated against is more impactful than having experienced the mental health difficulty or the distress in the first place. It's that ongoing impact that often takes its toll for people.
Yeah, absolutely. And I guess another question that's interrelated that I'll ask you first, Michelle, and then I'd love Tim's views on it is, why do some health services discriminate against people who have a dual diagnosis, schizophrenia and AOD issues? And the person writing the question is saying, I find this is the case in my local health service. So I'll get your views, Michelle, and then we'll hand over to Tim.
Yeah, unfortunately, this is an experience that people report frequently. So there are still some mental health services that expect that people's alcohol or other drug issues have resolved before they're able to support their mental health. And there are some alcohol and other drug services who won't take people while they're in significant distress. And so what we need is a system that actually responds to the whole person and what might be going on for that person in a way that doesn't require them to have addressed one or the other aspect of what might be going on. There's often a complex relationship between a person's mental health, their alcohol use, their drug use, and how their navigating their way through that situation. So it's certainly an issue that needs to be addressed so that people can access the support that they need.
Thanks, Michelle. Tim, your thoughts on that one? Tim, you're on mute.
I knew I'd do that. Anyway, it's really about the fact that that our health services are often the most stigmatized places for people with mental health and alcohol and other drug issues, and that they are looking at this from a context that is decades old, and ways of framing the way people lived decades old. Thankfully, in some areas we've moved, in drug and alcohol, we're moving away from this total abstinence to a harm reduction thing where people can live lives that they choose to live and make decisions themselves. But I think the artificial partitioning and separation of drug and alcohol and mental health is ridiculous. But we have it. That's how systems run, and it allows workforces to refuse service to some people, and so it's discriminatory because of that.
Thanks, Tim. And I'll stay with you for this next question. How do you think we can support lived experience leadership and the workforce so that the strategy will be meaningfully enabling systems change?
Okay, that's a good question. We support the leadership that is here, that is developing, and that is to come. We need to understand that we've worked for a number of years, forever, without a national voice. So we have to get behind and support the national peak bodies for consumers and for carers, or people with personal lived experience, and people with experience of being family and carers, etc. We have to look at projects like one that's being released, launched next Tuesday from the National Mental Health Consumer Carer Forum and the Mental Health Lived Experience Engagement Network from the Primary Health Network. You can look that up. But the Lived Experience Leadership Project, whereby they're launching a national repository of leadership resources. They're launching a co-designed governance framework and toolkit for leadership. They're resourcing a leadership training scoping paper. So there are things that are happening. We should look to the work in Victoria, which I had the luck of helping to work with the reference group around the need for an acknowledgement of harm that's been done to people because of stigma and discrimination and treatment throughout our history. People have been harmed. We need to say that's happened. We need to be able to work through that with whatever processes that requires, an apology, reparations, who knows. But this harm's happened. Unless we start to deal with that, how can we go forward? And how can we expect services and systems to change unless they acknowledge that that harm has occurred? I think we also need to look at real practical examples of this leadership. The Dr. Louise Burns team from RMIT University developed with the National Mental Health Commission the National Peer Workforce Development Guidelines. So we have a structural device there, which we've just witnessed in Mind's recent launch of their lived experience strategy, a practical example of how those development guidelines can be implemented in a CMO organisation. And we've had for years organisations like Flourish, also led by people like Faye Jackson, with saying, well, why not a peer worker? Why do our workforce have to be called, why not be lived experience peer workers rather than support workers? So there are leadership, very strong leadership things happening. There are places like livedexperienceleadership.com you can go to and look at all the research. There's so much there. We need the will and a little bit of the dollar to be invested in this, to bring it to scale, because currently we're still locked into this biomedical approach, and leadership is perceived to sit with that expertise. We need to bring that leadership more towards lived experience.
Thank you, Tim. And I am going to try and summarize a question from Michael, and it is for you, Tim. Well, I'm going to give it to you, Tim, and it's a big one. So, Michael, I'm going to try and summarize it. Australia has made a commitment under international human rights law to provide the highest attainable standard of mental health care. As one of the wealthiest nations in the world, this commitment means that Australia should be setting the example for others to follow. Michael references a number of reports, Not for Service report in 2005, and of course the Burdekin report from 1993. The question is, why after 30 years from the Burdekin report, multiple royal commissions and all that has followed since, are we still feeling like there's a long way to go on the issue of human rights?
You know, to be honest, I think it comes down to power, and it's where power sits within mental health and health systems, and that power has a lot of investment behind it and a lot of structural things that have developed, like our hospitals, etc. You know, I agree with the movement of people out of institutions into communities. That was never resourced, and so people are experiencing poverty, they're experiencing a lack of employment, they're experiencing homelessness, they're experiencing services that are designed to do things to them rather than allow them to articulate what they need and what will make them better. It locks people into mental health systems when people should be moving out of mental health systems into the general community. And, you know, it's, you know, there's a Lithuanian psychiatrist coming out to Themes conference shortly, Danius Puris. It's this burden of obstacles in front of people. There are such big obstacles that we have to shift. And certainly I think that's where the lived experience and the lived experience movement, the consumer movement and the family and carer movement are able to begin to do that. But when power sits so rigidly within a section of our system, and where everybody goes to that power for an opinion, we're only hearing that one story, and the general population are understanding that. And then we have, you know, depictions of people with mental health issues that are unreasonable, that depict us as dangerous, that depict us as subhuman, that depict us as people who are unpredictable, that can't have families, that can't work, that can't be reliable, and all those sorts of things, which are depicted by a media that really hasn't caught up either. So it's been 30 years, but let's just make it, you know, it doesn't have to be much longer, surely. We have the evidence, I think, that we can do stuff.
Thank you, Tim. I think we might be able to squeeze in one more question each for both Karyn and Michelle. So Michelle, I'm going to give you a double-barreled question. So you've got the two questions and you've got your free time to answer it as such. How will you measure the success of the strategy? And the second question is, how did trauma-informed recovery-oriented practice inform your approach to developing the strategy?
Yeah, so they're two really big questions. I guess to take the first one, though, one of the things that we were incredibly conscious of in developing up the governance structure for the strategy was to make sure that in bringing the groups together, people with lived experience were working alongside people who had experience in the systems that we were trying to change. And we were really considered and mindful in who we invited into those conversations to start with, so that we had people who were really open to reflecting on the role that the kinds of systems and institutions that they might have been working in perpetuate some of these structural forms of stigma and discrimination. We worked alongside our steering committee members and our technical advisory committee members to design our workshops, When we engaged with Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander communities, we engaged an Aboriginal-led organisation to do that engagement on our behalf, where they were able to really do that in a way that was culturally safe and appropriate for really recognising the impact that trauma has. But for many people, experiencing stigma and discrimination are in and of themselves a form of trauma and a form of harm. And so it was really important for us to be paying attention to all of those things as we were moving along. I can talk really quickly about measurement of impact, but I wanted to actually pick up just really briefly on the conversation you were having with Tim around why haven't we seen inroads in terms of human rights? And I actually think one of the really significant challenges is that we don't have great human rights literacy amongst our workforces. We don't train people in what it means to help people exercise their political, their social, their cultural, and their economic rights. And so it's really important that in actually looking at the impact that this strategy will have, that we're seeing an increase in rights literacy amongst our workforces. We're actually hearing that language in the way that people are describing the work that they're doing and the kinds of advocacy that's being undertaken. I think there are lots of things that we will need to monitor to be able to see that the strategy has been effective. Being able to look at the nature of the kinds of complaints that are being made to organisations like the one that Karyn works in will be really important. We expect that actually in the first instance, you may see complaints go up because people become more aware of what their rights are and the protections that are available to them. But then you would hope that as those complaints are made and opportunities for improvement are identified, you would see things shift in the other direction. So we'll need to measure not just the bad that is happening, the complaints that are being made, the experiences people are having of stigma and discrimination, but also starting to move towards measuring things like inclusion and participation and belonging and people's sense of value and self-worth, because they're the converse of what it feels like to experience stigma and discrimination. And it's not good enough for us to say that we're going to eliminate stigma and discrimination. What we also want to do is create a community where everyone is treated with dignity and respect, and we have that sense of common humanity. So if we can measure those things too, I think we'll be well on our way to seeing some success.
Thank you so much, Michelle. Very well said. Last one for you, Karyn, off the back of Michelle's comments around training. Your staff in the Anti-Discrimination New South Wales would be dealing with lots of complaints from consumers with mental health conditions. So how do you keep your staff up to date with techniques, and how do you train your staff to communicate with clients of diverse needs?
Yeah, it's something that we're really aware of, both in terms of our service delivery and making sure that we can communicate effectively and provide our service to people with differing needs, but also from the point of view of our own staff work health and safety as well. So we have provide training. Well, there's a whole lot of training within the department, so people can access that training. We've also, well, for example, not so long ago, a few months ago, we engaged STARTS to provide training on working with people with complex trauma. So we are kind of always looking for opportunities to skill our staff and to have awareness about how differing people, experience different situations, and we talk about it quite a lot. So we hope that, we're always trying to learn and improve on our capacities in that respect. But yeah, it's something that's front of mind for those reasons.
And hopefully an opportunity to draw on lived experience in one way or another.
Yeah, absolutely. I just want to put in a plug, if I can, while
Please.
in my last minute, things that Tim and Michelle were talking about, you know, in employment and getting people to participate more, is one of the things I don't know if people are aware of. It's on our website, but we work a lot. We have a working with the Disability Employment Network within the DCJ. We've got a series, it's a workplace adjustments series of videos and podcasts and information for employees and managers within the public service. I'm sure a lot of that information is transferable, you know, across the sector. It might be, I just would like to draw that people's attention to that. So it's in our tools and resources on our website. Have a look, it might be useful, helpful, relevant.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Karyn. I welcome and congratulate our three wonderful presenters. And if we could clap, I'm sure virtually, actually, we can have everyone virtually clap and thank Karyn, Michelle and Tim and all our attendees online today. This webinar will be available sometime next week on the Mental Health Coordinating Council's website. The presenters, as you would have seen in the chat, have given permission to share their presentation, so that will be shared next week as well. Participants will be sent an evaluation following the event, which is important so that we can continue to facilitate quality sector development activities. Thank you again, Karyn, Michelle and Tim and all our participants. And that brings us to the end of the webinar. Have a good afternoon. Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.